Edgar Poe was born on 19 January 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts. Abandoned by his father after his mother's death, he was adopted by John Allan and assumed the name of Edgar Allan Poe. In 1826, he enrolled in the University of Virginia. He got stuck into gambling and ran into huge debts, up to the point that he left university to find a job and cope with numerous debts. After a period spent in the army, he moved to Baltimore to live with some relatives. At the age of 27, Edgar Allan Poe married his cousin Virginia Clemm. In this period, he published numerous articles, tales, and poetry without much gains. Then he decided to move in New York. From 1839 to 1840, he was editor of the Gentleman's Magazine. In the same period, he published tales of the grotesque and arabesque that gave him a remarkable reputation. In 1844, he started writing the series of Marginalia and kept working at the tales, achieving great success with the poetry The Raven. In 1847, the death of Virginia affected him deeply, but it didn't distract him from continuing to write, though his addiction to alcohol reached the limit and led him to death on 7 October 1849. Poe is considered one of the most important writers of the Gothic, the grotesque, the occult, the mystery, and, with no doubt, of the horror genres that, at the beginning of the 19th century, were highly appreciated by readers. The film The Raven goes back over the mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe. At the time, the writer was found in a delirious and semi-conscious state while repeating the name Reynolds. The Raven appears only in the title and refers to Poe himself. While in Baltimore, without ideas for his new stories, Poe is suspected of being part of a crime that resembles that of the murders in the Rue Morgue, in which an orangutan belonging to a sailor cuts the throat of Madame L'Espanaye and strangles and kills her daughter, putting the corpse in the chimney of a fireplace. It is a detective story whose predominant theme is mystery. There are 2 murders in it, and the police initially failed to find the author. In the end, through different assumptions, thanks to the use of logic and therefore the analytical capabilities of Auguste Dupin, they managed to unravel the mystery. Fundamental element of the story is logic, or rather the ability to use it when necessary, which Poe praises by considering it as an art form. In the film there is a reference to the detail of the window that opens thanks to a nail connected to a spring, and a reference to the double murder of a woman and her daughter. While the protagonist is under interrogation, one of his rivals is tied to a table and cut in two by an oscillating blade. The scene is taken from The Pit and the Pendulum, whose protagonist, accused by the Inquisition, is sentenced to a series of tortures inside a dungeon that is a pit where he risks to fall in due to darkness, a blade that swings and risks cutting him in two, and walls that tighten. He always seems to be a step behind his executioner, and only at the end he will manage to escape his grip. The suspected leaves a note inside a mask, threatening that death will appear at a dance. The dance is that of Emily's birthday, Poe's beloved, who is kidnapped. The detail of the dance recalls the story The Mask of the Red Death, in which the Plug, dressed in a grotesque dress depicting a corpse struck by Plug, enters Prince Prospero's palace and kills everyone present. Here there is a strong Gothic-style matrix both for the setting, the castle and the rooms, and for the characters dressed in grotesque costumes that combine to stimulate a feeling of horror, and also for the presence of the Red Death, a symbol of plague and decadence, one of the predominant themes in Poe's stories. Another murder is committed, that of an actress in whose theatre a tongue is found, as in the story The Facts in the Case of Mr. Valdemar, whose protagonist, practicing mesmerism, initially avoids the death of Valdemar but fails to stop its decomposition. In fact, the tongue swells, becomes black, and his body begins to decompose. It is as if he were in limbo. Even if he is dead, Valdemar is able to answer, and, although with an otherworldly voice that seems to come out of a cave, he asks to be awakened or left in his sleep. Poe wakes him up, and immediately Valdemar's body turns into a hideous rotten mass. In this story, we clearly deduce two important qualities of Poe, namely the capacity for description and the great mastery of scientific subjects. In fact, in the work, he speaks of mesmerism, therefore of animal magnetism and resuscitation of corpses. A clue as to where Emily may be is found in the story The Cask of Amontillado, where there are two predominant themes, that of revenge and that of madness. The protagonist, Montresor, wishing to avenge himself on his enemy Fortunato, who insulted him, decides to wall him in the cellars of his palace, driven by an unreasonable and blind desire for revenge. Convinced that Emily is hidden in the basement, Poe and the police find the body of a missing sailor walled behind a wall, as in the story The Black Cat, whose central theme is that of madness. The protagonist, after taking an eye out of his cat and hanging him, casually finds another very similar cat, equally black and without an eye, but without the white spot on the chest. Then he begins to dislike this animal, so he tries to kill him, but ends up hitting his wife, who dies under the blow. He decides to bury and wall her body in the cellar. In the end, the moment in which he finds himself demonstrating the solidity of the walls of the house before the police, he hits the wall where he had placed the woman's body. They hear a noise that almost seems to come from beyond the grave. The police demolish the wall and find the cat resting on the head of their deceased wife. All of this serves as a starting point for Poe, who understands who is the author. Then the killer accepts Poe's pact, which offers his life in exchange for that of Emily, who is hidden under the floorboards, and this leads to the story The Telltale Heart. Central is always the theme of madness, although the protagonist declares himself sane and is convinced that he has designed everything according to a logical and coherent plan. The character is actually sick because he is obsessed by the eye of the old man with whom he lives. He initially decides to observe him, then one night he kills him, dismembers him, and hides the corpse under the floorboards. Here emerges Poe's singular accuracy in describing every detail of the story, specifically in describing how the protagonist was attentive to every minimum aspect to avoid being discovered. After the arrival of the police, the protagonist has a nervous breakdown due to the fact that he feels the heartbeat of the old man as if it were wrapped in cotton, even though he is dead. Poe describes in a masterly way the change of the character, which passes from a phase of excessive tranquility to one of sudden nervousness due to guilt feelings. Emily is released and Poe is poisoned. A passerby will find Poe dying on a bench while repeating the name Reynolds. In conclusion, Edgar Allan Poe was not only one of the greatest authors of Gothic literature, but also the precursor of the detective story, of the horror literature, and of the psychological mystery novel. In my opinion, and as defined by many people, Poe is a master of horror in that he is able to describe in such a detailed way details and scenarios of his stories to the point that the reader, identifying himself with them, at least as far as my emotions are concerned, can imagine the whole story as he saw it in a film, entering into the heart of the scene and becoming a witness. The 7 stories described above struck me both for the plot and for the style. In fact, some stories aroused anxiety and terror in me, but not a negative terror, but rather a terror of astonishment because of the grotesque images described in a sublime way. A story that has particularly fascinated me is the facts in the case of Mr. Valdemar, since I not only managed to imagine every detail and to be struck by Poe's descriptive and detailed ability, but above all, I was positively impressed by the terrible images represented in an almost maniacal way.